Hello everyone, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. Wishing you an enjoyable listening experience. Today, the book we're interpreting for you is The Confidence Game. In the news and in life, we often hear about or personally experience various scams. For example, someone spent tens of thousands of yuan on a so-called miraculous mattress. Family members of patients spent a fortune on unidentified life-saving medications outside the hospital. University students were deceived out of thousands of their living expenses by online acquaintances. Why do people fall for these scams? Is it because the scammers are exceptionally cunning? Or are the victims exceptionally foolish? The book we're discussing today answers these questions. The author of this book, Maria Konnikova, is a psychology PhD from Columbia University in the United States. She gathered a wealth of real-life cases from news reports and interviewed some of the individuals involved in these scams. She meticulously dissects these scams, from their planning to execution to conclusion. The book received recommendations from magazines like Forbes, The Economist, and The New York Times, just to name a few. The New York Times Book Review magazine said, "Konnikova's eye is like a giant's. She unravels the intricacies of this dark art of deception." The book is divided into 10 chapters, which can be grouped into 3 parts. The first part is the first chapter, where the author provides a profile of the scammer. The second part encompasses chapters 2 to 9, where the author breaks down each step of the scams, analyzing the psychological principles behind them. The third part is the 10th chapter, where the author offers advice on how to prevent being deceived. Next, I will interpret this book for you in 4 parts. 1. What are the characteristics of scammers? 2. How do scammers set traps step by step? 3. Why do people fall for scams? 4. How can we protect ourselves from being deceived? Let's start with the first question. What are the characteristics of scammers? What kind of people become scammers? Are they born this way? Do they all appear disreputable and sinister? The author believes that scammers don't share common physical characteristics, but they do have some common personality traits. Psychologists summarize these traits as the dark triad, which includes 3 personality traits with dark attributes. The first is callousness. Scammers typically exhibit extreme callousness, with their actions solely focused on gaining personal benefits. They completely lack empathy for others, and others' suffering means nothing to them. So when people confide in scammers about failed love or family tragedies, scammers show no emotional response. Instead, they see it as an opportunity for profit. The second personality trait is narcissism. Scammers often have high levels of narcissism, believing they are superior and cleverer than others. A study of nearly 600 corporate fraud cases in 78 countries found that nearly 50% of individuals involved felt a sense of superiority as they embezzled money from their companies. They see themselves as smarter and view others as fools, so they believe they deserve more. The third personality trait is a penchant for manipulating others. Many scammers are skilled at manipulating people's emotions to achieve their own goals through exploitation. Let's look at an example. There's a man named Stokes who is an addict. He frequently borrows money from neighbors to support his addiction. One day, his nephew is tragically killed in a school bus accident. After the incident, Stokes goes door to door in his community, sharing the tragic story with each neighbor and asking for donations to help cover the funeral expenses for his nephew's family. He even shows neighbors a photo of his young nephew on his phone. Many people are moved by the story of the young nephew's tragedy and generously contribute money. Stokes seizes this opportunity and profits greatly. In this case, Stokes exhibits the typical traits of callousness and manipulation. Despite the tragic death of his nephew being a family tragedy, he shows no genuine grief but instead uses it to deceive for money. Stokes' method of manipulation is showing neighbors a photo of the young nephew, creating a strong emotional contrast that evokes sympathy and prompts people to follow his advice and give money. Of course, not everyone possessing one of the dark triad personality traits becomes a scammer. 2 psychologists once conducted personality tests on 1,000 marketers. and found that over 10% of marketers had a tendency to manipulate others. Since marketers often require strong persuasive skills for sales, some may exhibit these traits. In fact, if personality tests were conducted on politicians, Wall Street executives, and legal elites, a high proportion with dark triad traits might be found. In other words, these individuals possess qualities that make them susceptible to becoming scammers. However, they remain engaged in legal activities. But when individuals with dark triad traits meet two additional conditions, the situation changes significantly. The first condition is having an environment conducive to scamming. An objective inducement. For instance, securities traders are typically honest, upright, and law-abiding. However, if their company's system has significant loopholes, traders may engage in fraudulent activities. A notorious example is the SAC hedge fund company, where lax internal oversight led to widespread insider trading, earning the company a notorious reputation in the United States. The second condition is finding a justification for their actions. A subjective desire. Someone with criminal tendencies, upon recognizing a favorable opportunity, will search for a reason to act. Many scammers believe they had no choice but to scam. And a survey revealed that about half of fraudsters claimed the competitive environment they faced was extremely unfair. They saw their scams as a way to level the playing field. Scammers often depict themselves as victims rather than criminals. The so-called unfair environment they describe is often the same for those around them. But most people do not become criminals. That concludes the first part. What are the characteristics of scammers? Scammers often possess innate traits like callousness, narcissism, and manipulation. However, they also need the right environment for scams and rationalize their motives. To become scammers, now, let's move on to the most exciting part of this book. How exactly do scammers set traps step by step? I'll introduce the method scammers use in 3 stages: setup, execution, and conclusion. In the setup stage, scammers typically have 2 steps to take. The first step is identifying their prey. And the second step is building an emotional connection with them. Let's start with the first step, identifying their prey. How do scammers pinpoint those who are the quickest to fall for their schemes? Get deceived the most, and make the scam most convincing. They commonly use 2 tactics. The first tactic is actively providing personal information to others who seem caring. For example, there's a scammer named Bernie Madoff, who specialized in defrauding stockbrokers. He was Jewish, and to many people, being Jewish implied expertise in investing or knowledge of insider information. When conversing with people, Madoff frequently mentioned his Jewish background. During conversations, he would carefully observe others' reactions, such as whether they were interested in his Jewish identity, or if they showed interest in insider trading. As soon as anyone displayed even the slightest interest, Madoff could accurately detect it and then use false insider information to deceive them. The second tactic scammers use to target victims is to become familiar with them. People often let their guard down with those they know. For instance, when someone can accurately recall your name, you may feel more comfortable with them. Therefore, making victims feel that you have a close connection with them becomes an essential survival skill for scammers. For instance, there was a hacking group that posed as security vulnerability testers and attacked companies' security systems. Within this group, there was one individual whose task was to engage in casual conversations at coffee shops near the targeted companies. While the discussions were often mere small talk, they had a significant impact because they created a sense of familiarity. People felt more friendly towards each other after chatting. And meeting again was no longer like meeting a stranger. When this person later encountered the victim and proposed testing the victim's company's security vulnerabilities, the victim would often think, "I've met you before, we had coffee together. I should help you out." Some scammers intentionally gather information about their victims and use that information to gain the victim's favor. For example, there was a scammer named Nancy who browsed wedding announcements in newspapers. She targeted the parents of couples about to get married as potential victims. Nancy memorized the names, addresses, and phone numbers of the bride and groom. as well as their parents, from the newspaper announcements. A few days before the wedding, Nancy would call one set of parents and claim to be a relative of the other side. For example, she would call the groom's parents and say she was related to the bride, because she could accurately mention the bride's name. The groom's parents would often believe her and meet with her without suspicion. The way scammers collect information about victims can even involve employing informants. For instance, there was an Indian monk who claimed he could help people communicate with deceased loved ones. In his reception room, he had informants posing as clients. When someone seeking help came to his reception room, these informants would pretend to be seeking assistance as well and engage the victim in conversation. They would then relay the collected information about the victim to the monk. This way, the victim believed they were meeting the monk for the first time. Yet the monk could accurately provide a wealth of information, making the victim believe in his supernatural abilities. Among scammers, there's a saying, once you've figured them out, you can sell them anything. This process of figuring out the victim is the investigation and screening process. In addition to these methods, modern scammers send out mass false advertisements through emails, in-app pages, and more. Whoever responds to these messages becomes an unwitting victim. Sometimes, these phishing messages are intentionally riddled with typos. In fact, these errors are meticulously planned by scammers. If people don't notice even the most basic mistakes, they're less likely to spot the flaws in the story. Once the victim has been identified, the setup moves to the second step, building an emotional connection with the victim. This is a critical step, as only when the victim's emotions cloud their judgment will they lose their rationality and follow the scammer's instructions. On dating websites, for example, Jack Morton Dennis targeted a 68-year-old American physicist named Paul. The two began frequent communication, and their messages were deeply personal. In his letters, Dennis continuously expressed his love for Paul, saying, "You are truly talented. I value that in a man. Your talent and my beauty are a perfect match." Paul's emotions were fully ignited, and he fell head over heels in love with Dennis. He even considered Dennis his fiancée. Paul agreed to every request Dennis made, including transporting cocaine, without a hint of suspicion. As mentioned earlier, Nancy, who reviewed wedding announcements in newspapers, successfully lured the groom's mother by accurately mentioning the bride and groom's names. She also moved on to the second step, building an emotional connection with the victim. She talked to the groom's mother about the scam is officially underway. During the implementation of the scam, scammers have a set of steps, which are as follows. Firstly, convince the target. Then, demonstrate how profits can be made to the victim. Next, let the victim experience some success. This encourages them to invest more. Finally, cast the net. We'll illustrate the steps scammers take in executing a scam with a case. A man named Melvin Barrett worked for a charity organization for 30 years and received numerous honors. In the year he was about to retire, his subordinate, Matthew Brown, asked him if he wanted to run for the position of police commissioner in Barrett's hometown, Lincolnshire. This is where Brown began implementing the first step of his scam, convincing Barrett. Brown told Barrett he had extensive connections in his hometown. His father had been a senior diplomat overseas, and his mother was a member of the Welsh royal family. Barrett became intrigued. At his age, nearing retirement, becoming police commissioner was an unexpected delight. To gain Barrett's trust further, Brown's mother wrote a letter, stating that only £10,000 from Barrett was needed for campaign funding, and she would contribute the rest. In the letter, she invited Barrett to join the family's charity board, further deepening his trust. Barrett decided to run for police commissioner. After the successful completion of the first step, Brown proceeded to the second step, demonstrating how profits could be made. Brown vigorously campaigned, rallied voters, distributed flyers, ran television ads, created a new website, and opened a Twitter account. He showed Barrett independent poll results, funded by his mother, indicating a continuous rise in Barrett's support. All these results confirmed to Barrett that he could surely become the police commissioner. Once Barrett had tasted success, he invested more, handing over his personal accounts to Brown entirely. At this point, Brown started closing in. He claimed that his mother's funds wouldn't be immediately accessible and that he needed some money to cover expenses. Barrett's money was transferred out of his personal account. In the end, Barrett was swindled out of £100,000. After executing the scam, scammers move on to the final phase. In fact, they may not even need to wrap things up, they can simply make a clean getaway. Why? Because out of a desire to protect their reputation, many victims choose to keep their victimization a secret, not wanting anyone to know. For instance, if physicist Paul hadn't been suspected of transporting drugs, he wouldn't have admitted to being scammed. Another example is a scammer named Damara, who posed as various professionals, from a prison warden to an English teacher in schools to a civil engineer in a construction company. He even had his experiences written into a biography. Damara managed to escape every time, changing his identity and continuing his scams. The fact that most scammers aren't even arrested is closely related to the majority of victims choosing not to report the scams. In a survey conducted by the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, it was revealed that only 37% of victims over the age of 55 admitted to being scammed. Among victims under 55, only half acknowledged being scammed. Most scammers are never brought to justice, they remain uncaught. In the end, the victims become unwitting accomplices, leading the author to assert that it's the victims themselves who guarantee the scammer's successful escape. To summarize, in the setup stage, scammers impersonate individuals you'd want to know or use your information to filter potential targets. In the execution phase, they persuade you to take the bait, let you taste success, and get you to invest more. Finally, after casting the net, scammers take advantage of victims' reluctance to tarnish their own reputation, allowing them to escape. Understanding the characteristics of scammers and analyzing their setup tactics can help protect yourself from falling victim to scams. Next, we come to the third part: why do people fall into the traps of scammers? Firstly, people often have a bias toward superiority. What does this mean? There's a saying, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. However, when it happens to oneself, many people believe they are unique, exceptional, and that good things can indeed happen to them. For example, 68-year-old Paul, as a physicist, believed he was more talented than others and that encountering a beautiful model wasn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. Similarly, Barrett, on the verge of retirement, with honors earned over 30 years, including the Order of the British Empire, naturally believed he was fully qualified for the position of Lincolnshire Police Commissioner. Secondly, people are reluctant to lose the sunk costs they've already invested. When people discover flaws in a scam, they've often invested too much in the early stages, whether it's emotions, trust, or funds. Admitting to being scammed would mean all those initial investments were in vain. This is essentially a problem of sunk costs. The sunk costs are too high, and they can't extricate themselves, they can only hope that everything is genuine. Lastly, environmental factors also influence whether people fall victim to scams. When someone is experiencing unemployment, divorce, illness, or any situation that makes them feel lonely and helpless, they become more susceptible to scams. Even individuals who are typically level-headed and patient can become more emotional, impulsive, and prone to taking risks during significant life changes. For example, a woman named Saffield had just gone through a breakup. On her way home, she passed by a psychic's shop, similar to what we might call a fortune teller. The shop's primary services included reading palms, astrology, and fortune-telling. She had been curious about the place before but had always been warned away by her boyfriend. Now, in her post-breakup state, feeling defiant, she decided, why should I listen to him? I'll just go and see what it's all about. That's how Saffield walked into the psychic's shop, unwittingly walking into a scam. Victims aren't necessarily foolish or greedy, they just happen to be emotionally vulnerable and less rational when scammers appear. If we had to summarize one commonality among victims, it's that they're all human, and humans make mistakes. Linguist David Maurer, who conducted in-depth research into the world of scams, summarized it this way: scammers probe into the weaknesses of human nature. Therefore, unless human nature undergoes significant change, victims of scams will continue to appear endlessly. In the final section, let's discuss how ordinary people can protect themselves from scams. The author provides 4 key recommendations, summarized as follows. 1. Have clear self-awareness. Clear self-awareness involves 3 aspects. First, know your limits and capabilities. For instance, if you lack a financial background and knowledge, don't rely on stock recommendations from others to make big profits. Similarly, if friends often comment on your short temper and you frequently argue with them, don't expect someone to suddenly appear and be entirely agreeable. Second, recognize when you're most vulnerable, such as during work difficulties, after arguments with loved ones, or when family members are ill. Avoid making major decisions during these vulnerable times. Third, understand what easily appeals to you. Are you quick to trust when praised, or are you powerless against people who love animals? Remain vigilant in the face of persuasive language to avoid falling into traps. 2. Maintain objectivity *, think logically rather than emotionally. Pay attention to details and engage in logical reasoning. This way, you can capture objective reality and identify inconsistencies. For example, if someone tells you a stock will skyrocket the next day, consider why they're sharing this opportunity instead of taking it for themselves. Similarly, if a stranger expresses love for you, remain rational and question whether you truly possess such extraordinary charm. 3. Gain relevant knowledge *, when introduced to unfamiliar domains by others, take the time to acquire relevant knowledge before diving in. Additionally, if a stranger claims to be a friend of your friend or that you've attended an event together, spend some time verifying this information with your friend or the event organizer. Doing so can be crucial. 4. Set boundaries *, many scams succeed because scammers push victims beyond their boundaries during moments of impulsiveness. Recognize that everyone is susceptible to being deceived, so before each risky venture, set a boundary. Determine whether you can handle the risk and what the maximum acceptable loss is. If the potential loss falls within your boundary, you might consider taking the risk as a valuable lesson. However, never allow others to goad you into trying again because doing so could lead to an endless pit. When faced with temptation, know who to turn to for help, whether it's your parents, your most rational friend, or law enforcement. In an era filled with various scams, the hope is that this book helps you better understand human weaknesses and the desire for good things. While the human nature to aspire to greatness and seek beauty is natural, it's crucial to be aware that not everything that glitters is gold. This awareness can reduce the likelihood of falling victim to scams. Alright, this book's interpretation concludes here. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom and practice to achieve our financial goals and create a better future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.